Paul, the Okanite, coming to you with what I think is something of a treat. It is an overview of North Africa 1941, a game recently published by GMT Games and designed by Mark Simonitch. North Africa 1941 is a continuation of the so-called 19XX series that includes games such as Normandy 44 or Ardennes 44 and so forth. And so it shares a lot of commonality with those games, but we're going to take a look at how it has been adapted to the North African campaign, at least during 1941, which is the time bound that the game deals with. Here I present an overview of the game, which means that I have read the rules cover to cover and looked through players' notes and the extended examples of play and so forth. So I've done all that, but I have not actually played the game, so I'm not going to actually go and issue any firm opinion at the end. But I will show you in some detail what the game includes and how some of the parts fit together. North Africa 1941 begins with the appearance of the Afrika Korps and Erwin Rommel in North Africa, with the first term being the latter part of March of 1941 and going through the end of the year. The game has 2 turns per month and begins with the second half of the month of March with an Axis-only turn. All other turns will include alternating player turns with the allied player going first. So, right away we know that the game does not include the Anglo-Italian battles of 1940 that resulted in basically the elimination of the Italians or something close to it, or the battles that occurred later in 42 and into 43 with the arrival of the Americans. In fact, the map does not even stretch so far as to allow for the Americans showing up. So I don't know if the game will ever be extended to include that. It would be quite a lengthy map if it did. But Mark does hint at a possible expansion should the game be received well. That would be for covering the year 1942, which I think would be excellent. And in fact, I wish it was part of the base game that I have in front of me. Let's talk about the components that you get in the game. First, the game box is the usual high quality GMT game box. Looks to be, say, 2 inches, 2.5 inches deep, containing all the goodies in the game. The reverse has all of the standard material that you find on modern game boxes, including sample counters and view of the map and some description of what the game is about. It also includes GMT's complexity rating. In this case, it's 5 on their 9-point scale. They put it right in the middle. I think it's close. I would give it a 6 just because I think the 19XX is probably a little daunting for people who are newer with the system. If you've played 2 or 3 of these before, you're not going to have a problem. If it's the first one, the rules tend to have a lot of detail in them. In some cases, if you missed one sentence in the rules, you might have a problem with things not working the way they ought to. So I think that the game has got a bit more detail than I would find in my run-of-the-mill midpoint game. But at the same time, it's no worse than any of the other 19XX games, and those familiar with those games are not going to have a big problem with this one. Solitaire is also rated by GMT as a 5, and I'm not sure why, because I don't really see much of anything in here that will diminish the solitaire experience. All the other 19XX games are very good at solitaire, and I don't see anything different here. I would give it a good 7. It's not purpose designed, so I'm not going to give it a 9. And okay, maybe it's just because of the complexity of the game, may not be an 8, but I'll give it a 7. I see no real barriers to solitaire play. No hidden information, no bidding, nothing of that nature. Playtime is listed as 3 to 12 hours, depending on the scenario that you play. Now, this is a 19-turn game when you play the full campaign. And I believe it probably would take a bit longer than that, but that's maybe just the way I play. But I generally find that to be true. The playtime listed on game boxes tends to be universally shorter than what I experience, and probably you too. At the same time, though, the game could very easily be shorter than most 19XX games because this is North Africa, and it's still at the same scale pretty much as the other games in the series, and so the counter density is lower than what you'd say for Normandy 44 or even more Ardennes 44. So those games have much more counters on the map than this one is going to have. And the map is a beautifully done rendition of North Africa, running from just short of Tripoli to the west and all the way over to Alexandria to the east, with a total size of just short of 5 feet by about 22 inches, so just short of 2 feet. So roughly 5 feet by 2 feet. So it is a rather sizable piece of real estate. And if you have a 4 by 4 foot table, well, you're not going to fit the full map on your table. The game includes a very nice paper map, and I would say it's good, solid, heavy paper. I wouldn't call it cardstock, but it is a very nice map that most people will not have problems with. But I think you probably would want to use plexiglass on it, as you would with most paper maps. And for me, I just love the mounted map, so I paid the extra and got the mounted map. And it also does much better when I make YouTube videos. It doesn't have the glare that plexiglass would show to the camera. The port of Tripoli is represented with an off-map box, and units can go ahead and enter the extreme west part of the map from Tripoli. Furthermore, it will require transporting units from Italy to get them to Tripoli, and then from there scooting down the map, with an option of actually landing them at Benghazi at some increased risk. The terrain on the map depicts what you'd expect to see, desert terrain of various sorts, and it's a very nice deserty sort of color palette that has been used for both the map and how it is reflected in the colors of most of the units. The counters, just under 500 of them, are the usual oversized 19XX counters, all beautifully represented and printed. The Italian and Commonwealth both appear in desert-appropriate color, with the Germans in their usual field gray. Units are divided into two major types: non-mechanized, which is basically leg infantry, as well as mechanized, which is most everything else. And within mechanized, it is divided into vehicular units such as tanks, recon, and 88 flak, versus non-vehicular mechanized infantry of a couple different types, including things like motorcycle units. But unlike other games that I've seen in this system, it also includes trucks, which play an important role in North Africa 41. For example, trucks can temporarily motorize a leg infantry unit. They can establish supply chains in places that couldn't otherwise have a supply chain, and they also transport combat supply to the frontline units for use in combat. Other counters include aircraft, although very abstractly as simply aircraft points. And Rommel himself is here, and he can augment the capabilities of on-map units, including things like granting them a reroll in combat, or possibly extending the movement range of the unit. And there are all of the usual 19XX utility counters, as in the other games. But my favorite counter, I think, in the mix is the Commando Supremo counter. And what this does is that when the Axis plays this counter, they can combine German and Italian actions together, so they have more of a coordinated approach to whatever it is they're doing. Commando Supremo, how cool is that? Player aids. Scenario setup and reinforcements are shown on setup and reinforcement player aid cards, just as in the other 19XX games. There's also two-panel double-sided cards containing all the charts and tables, so instead of giving you separate player aids, they have one that expands out, and so basically you have everything in front of you that you want. All this is consistent with the other 19XX games. The game includes both a rulebook and a playbook. The rulebook is 25 pages of rules, done in the usual 19XX style, which is to say, you got to pay attention to what you're reading. It's not hard to read, but with much of the detail that can be missed with a single read-through, you have to pay attention to what you're reading and probably read it a second time after you've moved some counters around the map. The map includes terrain such as escarpment, which is particularly interesting in its effects, as they limits the movement of vehicles. Vehicle units can only cross escarpment on a road, so it has a channeling effect to what is possible for generally attacking, and provides a defensive barrier that must be crossed. Also unusual is the trackless desert is represented with hexagons that don't have any borders. So the deal is that this is part of the desert that it's on most North Africa maps, but in fact, the troops of both sides tended to avoid this area because this was before GPS. You're out in the middle of nowhere, and nobody likes getting lost in the desert. The net effect is that you can go in there, but it slows down the movement quite a bit. Because of that, I think there's going to be a tendency to avoid that area and stick closer to the coast. Tobruk is represented along with the defensive belt surrounding it, which the British can go ahead and fortify and make it a hard nut to crack. And of course, ports are represented, and Tobruk is the largest port outside of Alexandria that's on the map. And there is a concept of port supply in the game to keep the units there supplied once they get cut off by the Germans. Units and combat supply must be transported to North Africa via the sea and enter at ports. For the Axis, the supply line will come from Italy and go over to Tripoli or possibly Benghazi. And the Allies simply go to the Nile ports without any chance of being intercepted. Let's go over some of the key concepts in the game, beginning with the sequence of play. The game's sequence of play is almost twofold. You have a game turn sequence, and embedded within that you have action impulses. For the game turn sequence of play, it begins with preparation, it's a cleanup phase where you pick up various combat markers and such from the prior turn, as well as take reinforcements and replacements and bring in some new supplies. Next is the action phase, which can be up to 3 action phases in a turn. In summer months, it's only 2. So when it's super hot in the desert, the armies were less active. There were only 2 impulses there. The rest of the year, there are 3 action phases. At this point, you would switch over to the action impulses, but I'm going to go ahead and finish the general turn sequence first. Next, after the impulses are done, you would do supply attrition. This is supply that's on map, and this is combat supply map. If it's not used, there's a possibility that it can just attrite away. So there is some element of use it or lose it in your supply attrition. It's not a huge probability, but it is there and it can happen. Finally, there's a victory calculation where basically the last turn, of course, you figure out which side won. But short of that, there's an automatic victory condition that can trigger if one side or the other is doing particularly well or the other is doing particularly badly, and it's relative to the actual performance of the armies in real life. All right, looping back to action impulses. Allies begin each turn except for the very first turn, which they don't get an action impulse. And each impulse begins with rolling for events, for various random things can happen. So, for example, a typical event might be an additional supply point becomes available to be used, that sort of thing. Replacements, you reallocate replacements to your units. Remember, this is a step reduction game, as are the other 19XX games. And so you have replacement counters, and you have to reintegrate them into units that have taken losses. You can also finish fortifications. Fortifications are definitely part of this game. In most cases, it will require a die roll to complete the fortification, so you're not sure exactly how long that is going to take. At the beginning of each action impulse, you would get a chance to complete a previously begun fortification. Then movement occurs, and note, in this game there are no Zoc bonds. This is the first of the 19XX games that I've seen. I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen plenty that did not have Zoc bonds, but instead uses a system of overlapping Zocs that are slightly downgraded versions of the Zoc bond concept in the prior 19XX games. Then combat occurs, which is your basic odds table, very much in line with previous games in the system. Recovery from earlier adverse results, such as disruptions and forced retreats, followed by a supply check to check for general supply. Now, this is different than combat supply. General supply requires a supply line, and it has to be able to trace back to a source of supply. And finally, placement of delay counters. I know Airden 44 had that, where the ally side could put counters down on the map, require additional movement point expenditure on the part of the Germans. Well, here both sides have that, and it is in the game in a smaller way. I think you get two of them each. And if you pay for strafing aircraft and have air superiority, so you can do that, you can get some more. The game is played across 19 turns, which, when you crunch the math, including having fewer impulses per summer turn, it comes to 42 impulses to play the campaign per side. Key differences from other 19XX games. First, naval movement. There's two types of naval movement in the game. First is coastal, which can be done by either side. It's basically port-to-port movement along the coast of North Africa. Is subject to interception and possibly putting damage or eliminating whatever it is trying to be transported. Then there's the Italy-North Africa link, which is also subject to interception, and it has a system of getting better or getting worse depending on when in the campaign you are, and I think some die rolls can modify that as well. And the United Kingdom to the Nile ports, which is not subject to interception, and is how the British get new units and combat supply in the theater. ZOCs are semi-permeable in the sense that when you enter a zone of control, you stop, generally speaking. In a subsequent impulse, you could go ahead and move out of it and move ZOC to ZOC. That's a possibility. Therefore, to be 100% certain that enemies cannot pass by units in their move, you need to have a physical chain of units adjacent to each other to block the advance of opposing units. There are three types of zones of control in the game. First is the generic EZOC, enemy zone of control. Units stop when they enter, and they have to pay 2 additional movement points to leave in a subsequent turn. Second are limited enemy zones of control, and if that's the case, then enemy units do not have to stop and only have to pay an additional 1 point to move zone of control to zone of control on a limited EZOC that is projected across an escarpment hex. Finally, overlapping zones of control. This is where you have 2 or more units that are not physically adjacent, but they're basically 2 away from each other, and the hex in between them is an overlapping ZOC, so both units are putting a ZOC on there. It is a weaker form of ZOC bond, and for all purposes it acts as a standard zone of control, except that it also blocks line of supply and blocks retreat. So units may not trace supply lines across an overlapping ZOC, and they may not retreat units across an overlapping ZOC. But overlapping ZOCs can be nullified by enemy units. So if you had 2 units and an enemy unit in between, the overlapping ZOC is nullified. All right, let's talk a little bit more about supply. As I mentioned, there are 2 types, general supply versus attack supply. Supply is a big issue in any North African game once you get up to at least a medium level of complexity, as this one is. And this game offers 2 types of supply. First, general supply. General supply requires a supply line to a supply source, and the net effect is that if you don't have that, you begin to degrade. You are out of supply, and if you don't reestablish it, you can start losing steps and eventually be eliminated. Second, there's attack supply. The attack supply is provided by supply markers that are transported to North Africa, moved within range of troops by a truck, and expended when attacks use 10 or more attack points or use an armor shift. So if you have a small attack going that is not going to use an armor shift, you can get by without using attack supply, but in most cases I think you're going to need to use that attack supply. Note that players receive 1 free attack supply point each impulse he does not use regular land movement as opposed to tactical movement, which is also in this game a carryover from the other games in the system. If you move 1 or 2 hexes, that's considered a tactical move. You don't even use movement points when you do that. Naval movement, railroad movement, that doesn't matter, but regular land movement, if you don't use regular land movement and don't do any attacks, then you get a free supply point. So This will have the effect of encouraging lulls in the action where one side or the other is going to be rest refitting and resupplying units, building up some reservoir of supply in order to be able to do a push later. I think some other games have done this. I think one of my favorites that has used this sort of concept was the venerable Randy Reed design, probably the biggest game Avalon Hill ever produced, which was The Longest Day. Had a system of you had supply chits on the map and you would consume them when you were actually attacking. This is kind of a similar idea to that. All right, let's go over the similarities the game has to other 19XX games. Other 19XX games have a very similar combat system. I would say it's a direct transplant. It's odds-based. Some of the results may vary a little bit, but it is basically the same idea where you get to push opposing units away, possibly disrupt them, possibly put them into a forced retreat, or possibly one side or the other takes casualties. Combats also can include the determined defense. So the defender who is forced to retreat can try to not retreat by making a die roll, and there's certain parameters that are used to make that more or less likely. And ultimately, if a retreat would require a defending unit to be eliminated, there's a desperation defense. So all these are direct carryovers from the prior games. The modifiers are similar. There's troop quality. In some cases, there's elite troops. In some cases, there are poor troops. I mean, the Italians take that one on the chin, as they do in most other games. Their quality for a lot of their units, especially the leg infantry, is not that great. There's artillery support, a big thing, and that does require, in general, attack supply. So it may take attack supply to have the units activate for the attack, but it may take additional attack supply to actually use artillery bombardment to get a modifier. Air units are present in an abstract form. They can go ahead and provide shifts, as well as the usual tank shifts that are in the other 19XX games are also here. And there are two very nasty Flak 88 units that do nasty things to the British as well. And Matilda tanks are also directly represented as being a little tougher tanks to deal with. The combat rules also include provisions for breakthrough combat, where you can have subsequent combat after the first if you do well enough, and it also includes automatic victories. So if it reaches a 10-1 by basically any means, it doesn't even consume supply. All right, as I mentioned earlier, this is a step reduction game, so units are 1 to 3 steps each, as in the prior games. 3-step units have a remnant unit, so you simply, when a 3-step unit takes a hit, it reverses, takes another hit, you swap the reduced unit for a remnant unit, and then if you take yet another hit at that point, it's eliminated, and units can be rebuilt and can come back in this game, even if they surrender. As a summary, my reaction to the game is that, well, it's going to be similar to the other 19XX games, which is very good, although I'm kind of excited by the fact that it's not going to have the unit density so that something like Ardennes 44 had, and I am hopeful that there's going to be a lot more tactical maneuvering going on that you would expect to find in a North Africa game. So that's really cool, assuming we get that sort of thing. I think the map is certainly big enough, certainly enough hexes to do that, and certainly the map is long enough. It's almost 5 feet. I wish 1942 was here, though. I think that would have been a nice addition. It's probably a marketing thing, I figure. You know, that they market these games with a specific year in the title, so it just wouldn't have fit in the box if they had 42 included, because then they'd have to say something like North Africa 41-42, which doesn't quite have the same ring that the other games have. But there is a possibility of expansion. Again, Mark mentioned that in his notes that was a possibility. Frankly, I don't think they would need a new map. They would just need maybe some new counters and possibly some rule extension, but not a whole lot. I'm hopeful that they can pump that out pretty quick. In general, this looks like an intelligent adaptation to desert warfare for the system, with its low density. Toning down the Zoc bonds, I think, to make things more fluid is probably a good thing to do. the actual treatment of supply and transport across the Med for the Axis units that may result in supplies not making it. That happened all the time in the real campaign, and it can happen here. So I would say that we're looking at a detailed and playable representation of at least part of the North African campaign in World War II. And I look forward to actually pushing counters around this big, beautiful map, and I look forward to having a North Africa 42 add-on show up. All right, so that's what I have to say about this one. So if you have subscribed already, I want to say thank you. And if you have not, I wish you would take the moment to go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, do all that stuff so you can keep closer track to what I'm doing around here. All that being said, I think that's enough for today. So this is Paul, the Oaken Knight, wishing you all a pleasant evening.